delighted to have Elihu Katz with us here today from our sister institution, the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania. I also want to recognize that Ruth Katz is here in the audience. I had the privilege and the honor this last November of being invited to a conference at Columbia University. Some of you will probably recognize this book. In fact, about everybody in this room will recognize this book. The conference that we went to was in honor of the 50th year publication of the book. And at that time, this version was reintroduced and republished with a new introduction by Elihu and an extended explanation of some of the effects that it had had over the years. There were some 200 people, I would guess, were at the conference, something like that. Some of the best leading communication scholars in the world. And their tribute to the effect of this particular work and its influence was just really quite amazing. Of course, the interesting thing of it is this was Elihu's first book, at least the first one I know about. And it was written in part while he was in graduate school. So pay attention over here, you guys. Of course, from the work that he did with Paul Lazarsfeld, who was his advisor at Columbia, he went on to publish quite a number of other things. In fact, more than 20 books. Some of them, many of them you will know, the work that he did with James Coleman on diffusion of medical innovation, and then later on the work that he did on media events, and with Danielle Diane, and the book that he published on the export of meaning with Tamara Liebes, which studied, better known by the object that it was studied by, called Dallas, soap opera Dallas. Elihu went to the University of Chicago, where he was for many years, but he also spent his time halfway around the world at Hebrew University. In fact, he became eventually the director of the Louis Gutmann Israel Institute of Applied Social Research, which I had the honor of being invited to talk at back in the mid-1990s, I believe it was, somewhere right around there. He's also was the founding person for the Hebrew University Communications Institute. So Elihu has gotten around quite a bit in his life and done quite a number of things. It'd be hard to cover all of them, but there are a couple of awards that I think are worth mentioning. He is the trustee professor at our sister institution, the Annenberg School, University of Pennsylvania. Before that, he was here for close to 10 years, I think, where he would come
On and off.
on and off, one semester every year, and it was really great to have him here. Elihu has won the UNESCO Canadian McLuhan Award, probably the most prestigious award in communication in the world. He's also won the Berta Prize in Media Research. He has honorary degrees from the universities of Ghent, Montreal, Paris, and Haifa. He's an elected ICA Fellow and an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's really delightful to have you. I should say, by the way, that just so things don't get too boring wherever he is doing whatever he is this semester at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences up at Stanford. So we're really delighted to have you here, Elihu. He's going to talk on, the title of his talk is No More Peace, How Disaster, Terror, and War Have Upstaged Media Events.
If you get to be old enough, you don't have to talk at all. The introduction takes so long. Well, thank you all for coming. I hope the paper lives up to the promise of its title. I'm best at titles. I don't know what happens after the title, but it's downhill after that. But this is, for me, a ceremonial occasion for more reasons than one. First of all, because the paper is inspired by the book mentioned by Peter, the book by Diane Katz called Media Events, which was in effect hatched here. We had a couple of semesters in which Danielle, Diane, and I were both here, and we had a Wednesday night seminar in which became a kind of jam session in which people dropped in from everywhere, and we carried on for this couple of years and then produced the book Media Events, subtitled The Live Broadcasting of History, now in 7 languages. So we're really proud of that. And this paper, the ideas in the paper are a co-production of Tamar Liebes and myself, but Danielle Dayan's specter looms everywhere throughout what I want to say, and it's too bad that he's not here, and then we could have a full ceremonial occasion. Now being the 15th, not the 50th, but the 15th anniversary of the book Media Events. But there are more other ceremonial reasons, one of which is a delightful surprise, and that is the presence of Bob Phillip, who used to be a faculty member here, now gone on to bigger things maybe, and who actually invited me in, what did we decide, 1974, after I did the work for the BBC, which is how you sort of tripped on me. And Bob invited me here, and from then I've had this long association with the Annenberg School at USC, and then I like to say I was traded to the Annenberg School, and now somebody said traded for Larry. So I want to thank Larry, I want to thank Peter, I also want to thank Peter Clark, who couldn't make it, who was dean at the time of the writing of Media Events, and who gave a lot of support to for mobilizing the resources that we needed to all arrive in Southern California and to produce this book. So thank you all for coming, and I'll tell you what I want to do. The paper has 2 parts. Part 1 is called No More War, and part 2 is called No More Peace. So, no more war. This is a phrase attributable to Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt, when he decided in the middle of some dream to say, I'm going to go to the Israelis, never mind that we're in a state of war, and I'm going to talk peace to them. I will go to their parliament if necessary and tell them that it's all psychological. It doesn't matter, but that it wasn't all psychological. What matters is that he got up and acted on this inspiration. And so Walter Cronkite heard about this. And Walter Cronkite said on a live broadcast between Anwar Sadat and then Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, do you guys really, are you going to do this? And Begin said yes, and Sadat said yes, and Cronkite's contribution to this event was then to ask when. And they said Saturday night. And so Sadat got on a plane, Egyptian airline, painted in bright letters. He landed at the airport between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. He was met with a huge reception of all the diplomatic corps and of the leaders of the country, including Menachem Begin and his government, and by Bob Simon, live on CBS, who said, will miracles never happen? Never cease, sorry. Will miracles never cease? And Diane and Katz, we were there, not at the airport, but we began to watch this, and we watched, like all Israelis and many Egyptians, for the first time there was a live hookup between Egypt and Israel. We watched for 3 days straight when Sadat appeared live on Israel television nonstop, visiting all the places, touching all the bases, not only the Knesset where he debated Menachem Begin, but the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Yad Vashem Memorial, and was treated as if diplomatic relations had existed since biblical times between Egypt and Israel, whereas just yesterday they had been diplomatic enemies. So anyway, Diane and Katz watched all this, and we decided that this was a fantastic example of media diplomacy, because as Sadat kept going day after day, he enraptured the Israeli audience. People fell in love with him. He was smooth-talking, very Western, very dignified, but very charming. And he smiled everybody down. And we said this is a fantastic example of media diplomacy, because at the end, the public opinion polls showed that the attitude of Israelis toward the possibility of peace had changed dramatically as a result of this visit. Of course, Sadat, it should not be forgotten, gave the Israelis what they had long hoped for, namely recognition by the major Arab power. So, and you can't do recognition better than live television with the whole world watching. So that was what the Israelis wanted, and Sadat said, what I want is for you to give back the territories taken in the Six-Day War between Israel and the Arab countries, to which Begin said, okay, to everybody's surprise. This is the story of Sadat's visit, during which, at the Knesset, he declared no more war. Hence the title, hence the inspiration for the title of this talk. Sadat also did all kinds of added all kinds of human touches. He exchanged pictures of his grandchildren with Golda Meir during this visit. He did all kinds of really interesting things that are interesting from the point of view of, and in honor of your new center of media diplomacy. But that's the story of Sadat's visit to Israel. Israelis having fallen in love with him, Diane and Katz saying, isn't this a classic example of media diplomacy? And then we thought again. We said, look, there are other events that are like this. I mean, we didn't think at that exact moment, but over the next months and years, not so many years, we decided there were at least two other events that were like this. One was the John Paul II's first visit to Poland. The Polish Pope had been elected for the first time. The communist government of Poland had little choice but to invite the leader of the Catholic Church, which they had been trying to suppress for those many years. And so the Pope came to Poland the way Sadat came to Egypt. No diplomatic relations, in quotes. Gets on a plane, lands on this enemy territory, stares down its leaders, and conquers the people through a reluctant live broadcast of his every move through Poland. There's some nuances to this which you can read about in Media Events, the book. But the parallels are extremely interesting. A charismatic figure who makes a decision to stare down an opposition and conquers public opinion such that, in effect, he's beginning to contribute, as Sadat contributed to peace, he's beginning to contribute to the downfall of communist East Europe. Joining forces, I'm not going to go into this. It's in the book, and perhaps you all know about it. And then we thought of the moon as another example of people, not quite the same example, but declaring we're going to conquer those moon people by staring them down, so to speak, by planting our flag. So get in a plane, go fly a long way, cross a boundary, in this case the boundary of gravitation, land in this enemy territory and take over. So then we said maybe media diplomacy is not the right name for this. So we began to call it conquest, but in the romantic sense. Not conquest, but you stare them down in the romantic sense. So, and then we said, but this is just, I'm skipping some years, and then we said this is one genre of live broadcasting, but there are other genres of live broadcasting that have captivated the world, that have riveted the attention of a whole nation or of the whole world. And we then label these other two kinds of events contests and coronations. So we had contests, conquest, and coronation. Contests are sports and politics. The Kennedy-Nixon debates is the classic political contest, but conventions used to be. Sports events, obviously, the Olympics, Super Bowl, etc. Coronations are weddings and funerals and occasional coronations. And so we had these three genres, which we then said collectively constitute a corpus of, quotes, media events. So then we realized that we were trying to reclaim the pejorative term media events, which had been something that people sort of said cynically, for a real life, live genre of broadcasting, which we, quotes, discovered. So we had these three things, contest, conquest, coronation, and then in a scholarly moment, we found that these paralleled Max Weber's three forms of authority, so that contests are rational, legal kinds of things. It's rules that are being celebrated in the boxing ring or elsewhere. Rules that are, or in the presidential debates, rules that are changed and reset, but formally they are the heroes of such events. And in the case of coronations, there's traditional authority, according to Weber, although he didn't know about media events. And in the case of conquest, there's charismatic authority, namely leaders with the magic to break rules, which is interesting because each of these cases, Sadat, the Pope, the moon, were all breaking some conventional rule of diplomacy, of gravity, and so on. So we then decided that this is a good book to write, and we wrote it. And you'll notice just another footnote that these three forms, contest, conquest, coronation, are the sort of high holidays of everyday broadcasting, radio and television. Contests is obvious. Quiz shows, from quiz shows to reality shows, they're all quizzes, contests. Conquests are Superman kinds of romantic savings of the world. And coronations are everyday kinds of celebrations in the news of all kinds of leaders and so on. But they're, in a way, everyday broadcasting writ large. So then we defined media events, and we said all three forms have the character of being live, interruptions, we stop everything to bring you to, and live interruptions that are pre-planned, scheduled and advertised in advance, the whole world watching. There's a norm of viewing, nothing more important than going home or than turning on the television set, not work, not family, not anything. Go directly to your television set. Reverent, usually narrated in reverent tones. Integrative, having the function of pulling society together for a moment, of reminding society. It's this great tradition of the British Empire, which was celebrating at this coronation or at this royal wedding, and it's time to forget about the crisis of the pound sterling. It's time to forget about the ethnic rioting in the streets of London. Just think tradition, and so on. So live, interrupt, pre-planned, the whole world, norm of viewing, reverent, integrative, usually conciliatory, reconciling difference. Note that this excludes events that are not pre-planned. That is to say, we are talking about what might be called ceremonial events. We excluded non-pre-planned events, and you'll see in a minute that that's the key to part 2. But it reminds one of the famous paper by Mollich and Lester, if you remember that, in which they say that most news is dictated by sources. The journalist writes down what he's told by some authoritative source and tells you that that's the news. And they say there are only 2 moments when the journalist gets closer to reality, unfiltered by the source, and those 2 moments are 1, accidents, and 2, scandals, where the source has lost control. And that's the key to part 2. We're now through with part 1. Okay. Well, I should say one thing about part 1, because that's the major contrast with part 2, and it's a big conclusion that comes at the end, but let me preview it. And that is that these events that we've talked about so far, ceremonial events, media events, are co-productions of establishments and broadcasters. The establishment might be the royal family or the International Olympics Committee or the Vatican and the broadcasters, so that they're really a collusion between, in the Mollich and Lester sense, between establishments and broadcasters. They are very comfortable. They celebrate the cultural base on which establishments rest. So from the beginning, we were criticized and were asked, how come you do the Kennedy funeral when the Kennedy assassination was also broadcast live? Why did you do the funeral and not the assassination? In other words, why? And we said, well, because we were doing pre-planned events, not disruptive. We were doing pre-planned, and we didn't quite realize that at the time, pre-planned and integrative events that celebrate society and culture, and we were omitting. We realized all along, but our argument was always that we were interested in the way in which broadcasting gathered the whole world to watch. And so we were interested in pre-planned events, which de facto also were integrative events, and we were ignoring the kind of major event which also interrupts the flow of life and the flow of broadcasting, but has a different character, or at least until lately, Liebes and Katz are arguing. Until lately, the broadcasting of disruptive events was an interruption in which you had a bulletin, the Pope has been shot, or something like that. And you went back to regular broadcasting because broadcasters didn't know or didn't want to cope with this kind of disruption. And then in the evening news, the late night news or something, they would summarize what happened as news, but not as a live event that captivated the world. And so that was the way disruptive events were handled. That's the way Diane and Katz said, we're doing ceremonial events that are integrative, and we're aware of the status quo bias of such events, but we are interested in to see how they work. And now we're arguing that the critics were right. The critics had a point. that disruptive events first of all, that they didn't even anticipate this in 1992 when Media Events was published, that these disruptive events would then take over regularly as live broadcasts. There was such, the Kennedy assassination being a classic example, but mostly they took this bulletin and late night news form. But gradually, disruptive events began to be broadcast live. And the hypothesis of this paper, this talk, is that media events of the ceremonial kind are declining in frequency. We haven't tried to prove it. And media events of the disruptive kind, specifically terror, disaster, and war, maybe protest, are rising in frequency. That's an assumption we're making, and we hope that we're right. In any case, whether we're right or wrong, we can explain why. So what evidence, I mean, accepting things like the Pope's funeral, Diana's funeral, since we published the book, Olympics and things like that, accepting those traditional, more traditional ceremonial events, what evidence have we for the decline of such events? Well, one is, I don't know about evidence, but explanation of why. One is the multiplicity of channels. That's obvious. It's hard to regather that kind of audience when it's all divided among, moved away from the networks, everybody with his favorite niche channel and so on. Hard to reassemble the audience. Secondly, everybody is acquainted, has become accustomed to, quotes, action news. So, you know, what's so special about going live to the neighborhood fire? Or if one can go live to the neighborhood fire, why can't one go live to somewhere else? And the answer is one can now because of the portability of the technology, which wasn't true, let's say, 15 years ago, when the television technology was very heavy and never arrived in time at disasters or terror events and so on. They were always there in the aftermath of the event, but obviously not there simultaneously because they couldn't move that fast. And they weren't ubiquitous as they are now. But more important, or no less important, is the idea of cynicism that has descended upon us. A cynicism about leadership, no more great men, maybe because of television, and cynicism about the media. So that nobody wants to believe in these ceremonial events anymore. Or at least they raise questions. Also because, yet another reason, is the short shelf life, so to speak, of these media events. The disenchantment with the aftermath of these events has grown. So that all the heroes of media events get assassinated. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Sadat, Rabin, and so on. They're all, this is as if the reward for being the hero of the world for a moment. There's the royal divorce, which follows the royal wedding, and so on. I won't elaborate that, but there's a disenchantment with the long-lasting effects of these events, notwithstanding that some of them had real effects, as I will argue in a minute. And we use as an example, as our best example, the history of Middle East summitry. Live broadcasting of summits between Israelis and Palestinians, first sponsored by the White House lawn, Jimmy Carter, entertaining Sadat and Begin, and it's downhill with every one of the summits since then. I mean, Clinton tried after Carter did with Arafat and Rabin. Clinton tried again with Arafat and Barack. Bush tried with Sharon and Abu Mazen. And all these events became less and less gripping, less and less believable, and nobody really tunes in to Middle East summitry anymore. So No more peace. Now, what's the evidence for the rise of disruptive events? Well, I think it's pretty clear. But again, to measure frequency, because they're coincidences, they're unplanned events by definition. So how can you say that the frequency of hurricanes or the frequency of New Orleans or the frequency of terror or the frequency of war have increased? But maybe they have, or at least the kind of war that fits the television screen has increased. But this is sort of a separate story. But anyway, what we're arguing is that we think there's good evidence for the rise of disruptive events that have pushed these ceremonial events away. The technology is portable. They're there. They don't need pre-planning because the media are ubiquitous. They're action-oriented, and they're anti-establishment, which maybe is what the establishment deserves. But that's our argument, and there'll be a question period. You can tell me I'm wrong. So we're going live now to terror events. Israelis know this for a long time. I mean, the terror events can be broadcast live. The media get there late. What they do is spend 24 hours with each major terror event and recycle the ambulances, the rabbis, the generals, and it goes on and on. And in a famous phrase re-proposed in this paper, we talk about disaster marathons, where terror events are recycled and have the consequence of pushing the establishment to act more precipitously than it might. The public is thought to be reacting to this marathon of disaster in a way that demands action, retaliation, etc., which a more sober situation might not immediately produce. So that governments are being pushed so it's a well-known script, this disaster marathon, except that the media are getting there earlier. And in terror events, at least, we have 9/11 to prove it, that the media are there. The media were there in the Munich Olympics too, but it's a very different case. But anyway, the key is that the media are there while it's happening, not after it's happening. They stay live instead of cutting away, as they did in Munich, by the way, from the live broadcasting of ceremony. And they show the horror of what's going on in an unplanned event that is disruptive. So we know about terror, we know about the tsunami, we know about Katrina, and here the enemy is not the terrorist, but God. God is saying to establishments, you can't control this. And you thought it was the Garden of Eden? Watch how you get thrown out of the Garden of Eden, whether it's in Southeast Asia or in New Orleans. And the establishment has nothing to say about it. And again, the media are pushing the establishment. Now the media are there before the establishment and saying, where are you? And war is another example. The wars, they're small wars now. The media have access not only to the battlefield, which is this strange story of embedding, which was as if a capitulation to the media criticism that in Gulf War, you kept us in a full-time press conference, and we didn't see anything, and our audience didn't see anything. Let us into the battlefield. And there was this brilliant response of embedding. Okay, you want to be in the battlefield, get into this tank where you can't see anything. And tell us about it. But in the process of covering these wars, which have all been threats to establishments because they can't manage the media, not like Vietnam where it took 3 days to get to film, and even then they couldn't manage the media. But now, or in the various small wars, there have been an attempt to corral the press into small groups of representatives of the press, and we'll tell you when we're going to fire the first shot at Argentina, and you can tell your, and so on. And now that's the latest wrinkle of that is embedding. But there's another thing that the story needs to take account of beyond embedding, which is another form of control, and that is that the media have access to the other side. Take the Palestine-Israel thing, where the media just commute. You just put a sign on your car, television, and you drive across the border from Jerusalem to Ramallah, and you see that side today and the next side tomorrow, and it's a whole other war if you can see both sides. Again, a threat to establishment control of the media. So this is our argument, no more peace, but the main point of our argument is that what in the ceremonial event, if the ceremonial events were co-productions of establishments and broadcasters, the disruptive events are co-productions of the anti-establishment, whether it's God or the terror or the enemy on the other side. It's co-productions between anti-establishment agencies and the broadcasters, over which establishments have very little control. This is not planned in any special way that I know of. I don't know about conspiracies, but in any case, that's the story. That's our hypothesis, and the reasons why we think it's happening. So I'll conclude. It's okay to conclude? First of all, we argue the displacement of media events by disruptive events, which is impressionist hypothesis. Statistically, it's probably very hard to show, count. But that seems to be the case. It certainly is the case that the disruptive events have taken their place alongside these ceremonial events as the subject of this kind of live broadcast marathon, which people are absolutely fascinated by, even if all you see is rain or the smoke. Secondly, these events are performative, both the integrative events and the disruptive events. Using 3 days of live broadcasting on television, it can be said that Sadat and Begin changed the face of the Middle East, or at least we hope that that will progress in a positive way. But in any case, it's a performative event of the kind that sociolinguists can only dream about when they talk about performatives. And similarly for the disruptive events, if it's true, if we're right, that these disruptive events push establishments to do things precipitously, or at least more dramatically than they might otherwise, these events have a performative quality. And the change, and the third and last point, is that there is an obvious change in the locus of control. Establishments have lost control, by definition, of these disruptive events in the very ways that Molach and Lester anticipated when they talked about the exceptions to their mainline news being source controlled, and they talked about accidents and scandals, and we talk about terror, disaster, war, maybe protest. Thank you.
Who would like to ask questions for Elihu?
Easy
Yes.
question. Okay.
Think if there's any link between your hypothesis that the de-emphasis of the first type of event and the sort of Bush administration de-emphasis of holding. I mean, they don't really hold press conferences. It's almost like they take advantage of, oh, we don't get distracted by all the disasters. We don't even really need to do these events anymore.
Well, it's a good theory. I'm not proposing that, but I hear what you're saying. I resonate to what you're saying, but only on a very personal level. he didn't say in this extended introduction that I was the first director, or at least head of the task force that introduced television into Israel. It's in effect the first director of national television in Israel for 2 years, something like that. And the journalists were after us every day. They want to know why weren't we on schedule? Why did we buy equipment? Why did I use equipment? Why did, nothing worked, and so on. Every day. I, as head of this thing, prayed for a disaster. Every day. So that's the best I can do.
Bryce, I was just thinking, when you were talking, what about pre-planned disruptive events? I was thinking of the twin invasions in Iraq, and also one of the stories I covered as journalist, the New York police's brutal, lethal putting down of the prisoner revolt in Attica. These were planned. You could cover those in advance.
That's a great question. Actually, you should have mentioned that while we call disruptive events, while we label disruptive events as not pre-planned, they're certainly planned from the point of view of their perpetrators. Whether it's God, which is my joke, but the terrorists are tuned to the media. We all know about the symbiotic relationship between terror and the media. They need each other. And it's very pre-planned from that point of view. And in fact, Gabriel Wyman, my former student and now colleague, has written a book about terror, claiming that terror is a media event, and arguing, and I have no argument with that, meaning live broadcasting of the kind of the no more peace kind of broadcasting. But he says the pre-planning is there, but not by the establishment, but by the perpetrators. And that's an argument that in a way fits this new formulation that I'm proposing here, that disruptive events have a pre-planned aspect in the sense of a collusion between the perpetrators and the media. That has to be like in the Falklands thing. The British said we'll have press presence on the battleship, and in 3 weeks we will fire the first shot against Argentina. That's my allusion to Don't Cry for Me. So, but that's not really what you're saying. You're saying even the establishment has a timetable, which they'll announce in advance, or at least the journalists might find out. So yes and no.
Yeah. Along the same lines, it seems to me that there are other technological changes. I mean, give two examples. The recent demonstrations on immigration here in Los Angeles,
right.
Which quote surprised everybody.
Yeah.
By which the media meant we didn't know about it.
Right.
Were widely. That's right. Which were widely publicized and created by Spanish language media.
By the radio.
By radio, but by radio that wasn't paying attention to. So media becomes, in that sense, some media as opposed to others. But there's another component which has been claimed about these demonstrations. I'm not sure it's true, which is MySpace or other internet things. And in other cases, and here the specific example which people here have heard about from Manuel Castells, which is the argument that the Spanish elections, what was it now, 2 years ago, where the bombing happened just before the election, and the government claimed it was the Basques, when it was quickly, argued that it wasn't, that it was Al-Qaeda. According to their studies, it was text messaging and cell phones that created a counter story that took everybody by surprise. So you have
counter story which said
the government's lying,
and
it wasn't carried by the media.
Who did it?
Who did what?
It exploded.
Who was the author of
who were the perpetrators
of the bombing?
Yeah.
Al-Qaeda.
Oh, okay.
Which was that later.
You're not saying it's the government.
Yeah. But the implication here is that you have in a sense, another media force.
Right. Absolutely.
It's not. So
absolutely.
The media has now turned into.
Well, the internet as a recruiting, as a mobilizing medium I think it's amazing.
Following up on that, given that, like the rally here, that you had ethnic media that's Spanish language, primarily radio, you ended up with your celebratory with integration, okay? What's the parallel when you have a world of plural media and segmented audiences? What do you?
Well,
the social consequences?
we're talking about integration and disruption. So the parallel word in any case is disruption, but it might be from whose point of view, or disintegration, but in the literal sense of dis-integration. But of course, some of the celebratory events also have disruptive elements. Watergate we included in our original corpus. Based on the analyses of Lang and Jeff Alexander and so on, who all said that the White House as an institution and the Constitution, which provided for impeachment, came out very well. So in that sense, there was a kind of integrative aspect to what ostensibly might be thought of as a disruptive event. So similarly, terror events can be argued to have an integrative element. So Israelis, at least at the beginning when they were airline hijackings and so on, I'm not sure about now, reacted by closing ranks when there was a terrorist incident. And now it's not so clear.
I wonder how you can separate the two. There are many ceremonial events that then become disruptive, or the two cross over. It's pretty clear that the Pentagon planned that the pulling down of the Hussein statue in Baghdad, and it was orchestrated. But at the same time, the Marines came in and put an American flag over Saddam's face, totally changing the message of that event, and in the Middle East. And it just seems like the ceremonial event is almost like teeing up something for somebody else to come in and disrupt.
Well, you can satirize it. That's pretty easy. If you go to where we were yesterday, the Getty, the new Getty, is a very interesting exhibition of how a guy named Hartfield systematically took Nazi posters and distorted them to come out as lampoons of fascism and to celebrate or promote the Communist Party and so. But that's an interesting story about how you can do a Saturday Night Live. But you remind me, there was once a Saturday Night Live where they're talking to Bush and they said, things aren't going very well. He says, but he says there's soon going to be a democracy and so on. And then they say, well, we don't know whether any leader, any democratically elected leader can hold things together, predicting today's New York Times. And then Bush says, well, if necessary, we might need a strong man as the leader, and perhaps somebody like Saddam Hussein.
Two words I'd like you to answer to. I think the media has been considerably faulted in the past 40 or 50 years on the word truth, and that is using it as a goal. I'm also worried because you used the word cynicism once or twice, and I think that the media has created this, itself has created this notion of cynicism, but it's failing to recognize that a fundamental part of civilization is trust. And do you think that the media has not been very helpful in encouraging the notion of trust within social structure?
My colleagues, Jameson and Capella, have written a book on media, on the way in which the cynicism that journalism promotes, so they say, it has been turned against the media themselves. So if you learn cynicism, then you can redirect that. So the problem of who to trust and why aren't there any great men and the need for trust is clear, but I don't have any words of wisdom. Perhaps you want to elaborate.
Oh, not particularly. I've published a number of papers on the subject, but just wanted to hear your points.
Well, tell us, I mean,
Well, the issue of truth is that the Republic was founded, Thomas Jefferson pointed out that in this society we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate error so long as reason is left free to correct it. So you have these two aspects of pursuing truth, and I do think that the journalistic and broadcasting community for the past 50 or 60 years has not conducted themselves with that as their guide. But that's the guide for living in a republic.
well, you're implying that the truth somehow resides in deliberation, in a marketplace of competing ideas, out of which there will emerge some kind of consensus, or at least agreed disagreement, or it's not truth. I mean, it is deliberative. I hear you to be talking about deliberative democracy, which is a problem. I mean, I'm not going to give my Habermas speech, but how you arrive at this truth is really crucial. And in my opinion, the present state of television, which is almost dead anyway, it makes it almost impossible, to agree on an agenda, because the focus is not consensual enough, not centralized enough. It's all dispersed. And secondly, to see the other sides of the division of opinion with respect to the agenda. Both of those, I argue, can be better served, theoretically. Some people call me a fascist for saying this. By having, if you had one channel of television and the news between, oh, never mind, you had one news program on all channels in prime time, between 8 and 9 p.m. or something like that, and had everybody watching, you would then have a shared agenda, and if it were truly public serving television, you would see the array of opinion with respect to the issues on the agenda. And if somebody wants to say, but any one news broadcast will have its own bias. So I would agree that the news broadcast, the one and only between 8 and 9 p.m., should be produced every night or every week by a different news production company. But anyway, that's the best I can do. Sandra.
I wonder if the pejorative meaning of media event, if we're coming full circle,
has changed?
well, that you and Danielle constructed it in a very different way from its original meaning. But I wonder if it isn't coming back more to its original meaning, in the sense that events are being produced for the media to construct heroes out of villains.
Mm-hmm. Well, the original idea is clearly cynical. It's a media event. It's only a media event. And you're suggesting that maybe that's returning in the celebration of mission accomplished or so on. Mm-hmm. Maybe. Yeah.
I'm not sure how it sort of fits into the theory, but it's just an example of a celebration that's a collusion between media and the establishment. It's not a live event, and it's just that over break I was recently in Thailand, and for every movie in the theater, which are very nice modern theaters and so on, there's a short clip which is shown, which is the king. And everybody stands, and the national anthem is sung, and it's these beautiful images of the king, traveling throughout the country, visiting all the different minority groups, the Muslims in the south, and so on. And people don't seem to take it with the kind of cynicism that I think it might be greeted with if something like that was attempted, I don't know, here or in England or something.
Well, the early BBC did exactly that. Every news program, every day, was opened by what the Queen did today. And that was the top of the news. But that's long gone. And But they're still flag waving. I mean, the Arab broadcasting begins with readings from the Quran. Israeli television closes the day, its broadcast day, with the broadcasting of the national anthem. So it used to be true in the United States.
Except they never closed it.
All right.
The following of what's understood, I wonder if it's possible to stage an event the way the White House has been doing it anymore, because we sort of caught on to the scenario, and it's like looking behind the curtain. Once you see behind it, and the internet plays a role in that any staged event now immediately becomes critiqued on the internet. Plus, you mentioned satire. The satire breaks out instantaneously. And I wonder if the internet doesn't serve as sort of a debunker of that type of activity.
Yeah, well, staged events has been a problem from the beginning in broadcasting and maybe in journalism more generally. And public relations exists to try to promote pseudo events of this kind. You know, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Hilton hotels, and how about that? So, to which I made that up. I don't know if it's true. To which Diane and Katz say that media events, in our sense, require the agreement of, in our original sense, of the organizers, whoever they are, the broadcasters, presuming that they are free to say no. And theoretically, they are free to say no to a presidential request to broadcast to the nation. They can say no, or they can say only on condition that the opposition gets a chance to respond. So, and the audience. So we can show events that have been agreed by organizers and broadcasters, but not by the audience. Begin and Sadat won the Nobel Peace Prize. There was a live broadcast from Oslo of the awarding of this prize. Slight details: Sadat didn't come, Begin came, but nobody, including the Israelis, watched because it was a non-event. It just wasn't interesting, and it wasn't real enough. It was very nice and all that, but it didn't mobilize, didn't rivet, didn't hypnotize in the way that an event that's agreed as something we wouldn't want to miss, like, I don't know, like the Olympics or the royal wedding, if you can remember that. You're too young, probably. Actually, we watched the royal wedding maybe in this room. When was the royal wedding? Yeah, it could be. Got up and had scones. Okay, I think
Well, we
we've
want
done
to
it.
thank you very much for sharing.